So thanks for the opportunity to present here today. I'm going to provide a snapshot from our context in Iraq in the second half of 2017. And what I've tried to do is draw out what I think are the enduring themes, and I'm happy to see that a lot of those have been covered already today. And I'm also going to offer a model for consideration as well, which I think has what I think are the four key enduring BPC effects that can be delivered regardless of the type of operation. So I'll get this working here. So I'm going to dwell on our context very briefly in the presentation, just so that you understand the lens by which I look through this particular problem, and it's obviously coloured by our time in 2017. I'm going to present a sort of a building partner capacity model. It's fairly simple. It's something I've been chewing over since getting back, and I'd like to offer it to the doctrine writers to either take it or leave it. And then the last three parts there, I just want to take out some of the key themes, if you like, from our time, and I've grouped those into, building partner capacity in the fight, preparing for the next fight, and then preparing for the next war, of which the level that we sat at, we kind of transcended both of those, and Nick touched on a few of the challenges in his presentation. So just very quickly, as I said, I don't really want to dwell on this, but our purpose was to enable the Iraqi security forces to defeat Daesh, maintain long-term security in Iraq, and I think the second part of that purpose statement was really important to us. There are three key tasks. We delivered predominantly combat training to ISF individuals all the way up to brigade headquarters. So we did basic weapon training to predominantly at company level and collective training, but we got to battalion in some instances, and we were training brigade headquarters as well. We had an advise and assist role with the North Baghdad Operations Command. It was a role that was started a couple of rotations ago. We and Taji 4 had picked that up and taken it on and developed an enduring relationship with that divisional sized organisation. And then the third key task clearly was to protect the task group. The timeline along the bottom there, I guess, illustrates the dynamism that was the campaign. We arrived when Mosul liberated, not long after. Very quickly, the key objectives and milestones were announced by the PM as being liberated. Tal Afar, Hawija was next, and now Qaim out on the border. And then literally the day of our departure, the PM Abadi declared that Iraq had been liberated from Daesh. So what we saw from what was a slow campaign sort of hit the accelerate button once Mosul was liberated, and it changed very, very quickly. And not only was our strategic level having to sort of anticipate what that meant, we had to as well at our level to anticipate how we needed to shape ourselves for what was to follow. Along the bottom are some of our key ones. We saw the first of the formal force generation cycle where the Iraqis signed up to an agreed set of training for a bunch of brigades at a certain time period, and we started to push those infantry brigades through the BPC at Taji. We started to deliver forward air controller training for the first time to the Iraqis, and we also formally created a relationship with the Qawt Qassar, which is the Iraqi Special Forces Battalion, and the first of those was generated during our time as well. They're designed roughly on a sort of Ranger type organisation in the US, and very capable. We had a number of operations that we supported from the NBOC as well. 4 in total, they're prominently security related, and I won't go into too much detail about the sort of nature of it, but we played a key role in helping them through some of those key milestones, 3 security and 1 sort of very focused operation during our period. So that's our context. What I would like to put to you is a model, and having mulled on this over sort of the last few months about what is enduring, what is common, and I think they're the 4 key effects in blocks, and I've contextualised that by putting the importance of those both in a short-term and long-term sense on the y-axis and the urgency along the bottom, and the reason I do that is to try and demonstrate the tensions that were being pulled at the operational level, task group level, and obviously back in the national capitals as the focus of BPC shifted around these 4 quads as the campaign accelerated. clearly the most urgent and the most important was building partner combat success. In our context, it was critical that we got the Iraqis into a winning position, and they kept winning. And really for them, the watershed moment was Mosul. Our particular role in that was minimal, other than previous task groups training the forces and of course ourselves, who were then thrown into that. And I'm sure Nathan will talk to this potentially in his presentation. But again, the key is trying to identify what is the effect in terms of TAA or TAAA or TAAE is required to enable that. And it really comes down to the quality of the partner force that you have. Now, you know, broadly in the Iraq context, it was between battalion and brigade is where you slotted your AA teams into, and that was relatively successful. In a lot of cases, there is a requirement to push down further into lower echelons, and that comes with an increased risk, and obviously the very tight controls from all of the partner nations as to how you go into that. But really, the big things that I think we provided as a collective, not just talking about our task group, but as a coalition as a whole, was command, control, know and strike. They were the big four in terms of combat functions that enabled the Iraqis to be as successful as they were. Our effort was in the bottom right quadrant, really. Lower urgency at the time, but that got dragged left as the campaign accelerated. But it was focused on generating the units and the brigades to go into the next fight, so the follow-on echelons, but also to be dealing with the rest of the country, which outside of the sort of big conventional fights to the north and out to the west, was still a problem that, you know, in terms of rear area security problem, particularly in Baghdad, which was the strategic centre of gravity for Iraq, protecting the core was a key task, and we were partnered with a force that was absolutely integral to do that. So for us, we focused, as did previous rotations, on developing lethality at company level. That was really important. That became, you know, a number of CG's mantra: make your companies lethal. And you know, that was pretty clear guidance, and it absolutely worked in enabling the combat echelons of the Iraqi army to be successful. Concurrently, we also focused in on the brigade leadership and their C2, which did require a lot of work. We had probably three armies in the Iraqi army. We had the senior leadership group, which were predominantly British trained. We had brigade and battalion commanders that were US trained. And then we had, you know, the junior commanders, of which has got a very much an Australian flavour on it. So trying to develop a cohesive C2 system was very challenging. And therefore it was critical that we had to identify, you know, where they're coming from in terms of the influence that they had placed on them in their formative leadership training. Obviously, we AA'd at sort of Div and up in our particular instance, and that's not just advising, assisting, but it's also helping them with their own force generation and providing the training before they would go on operations, mission-specific training, which we had the ability to do on occasions when our dance card wasn't filled centrally by Baghdad. As the campaign accelerated, it became clear that the focus needed to go to the top two, particularly the top left quadrant. And there was a lot of work, you know, particularly, you know, once Tal Afar was liberated, to have a look at how we build, you know, strategic military capability of the country that we are supporting. And I think this is a really important thing. It's something that we couldn't directly influence, but we had some influence, you know, through our sort of higher headquarters. And it is certainly in a conversation that the Joint Task Force commanders were having with each of the contributing nation capitals as well. But a really difficult question. And, you know, the failures of that period, you know, 2011 to 2014, would probably link back to strategy. It's the capability of that force, it's the organisation of the force, it's the efficiency of their training system and the efficiency of the force generation system. And there was a realisation we needed to go back and help them reform elements of that. We didn't even know at some points exactly what that system looked like. I mean, at points there were large chunks of the Iraqi military that still needed to be mapped out, that we had to go back and do that work in order to help them identify where those weaknesses were. Obviously there's a lot of investment by a number of countries that go into Iraq, and that is great, but also a challenge because you may have a force that is equipped from a multiple array of sources with different capabilities, and we have enough trouble integrating capabilities, let alone a country where it has a number of capabilities from very well-meaning countries or otherwise. So that became really important. I think that's an enduring theme. And my last quad there in the top right, I would put it to you that where our strategic interests intersect with persistent conflict or persistent instability, we've got to be in the right quad, and we've got to be in that game in a fairly significant sense. Now, I can't remember who it was that made the point, but the DCP, and I think there's a presentation done on this, is absolutely critical to that, as is the number of exchange postings. Sorry, it was you, Professor Blaxland, made the point about that, but it's absolutely underscores the point that where those interests intersect with instability, we've got to have an enduring relationship with those partner countries. So that's the model that I put forward. Happy to debate that whenever. What I want to do now is to just bring out some of the, I guess, the more tactical type lessons, if you like, that we pulled out of our time, and I'm fairly confident these would be enduring from most of the rotations in Iraq, and I would suggest from BPC missions in other countries. But in terms of the AA piece, and we had a fairly limited role here, but really, what do you bring to the table to support your partner force? I mean, you might show up with great intentions, but what is it that you bring? And for us, the most valued thing was the access to the ISR and some of the other coalition enablers. And that's a really important start point. You've got to provide value to your partner force. Trust is absolutely critical. It is hard to build. It's easy to break. We gain trust by persistence and being present, and that was having our small AA team slowly getting their toe in the door, then their foot into the door, and then they became a permanent fixture in operation, or the operations centre. Now that, of course, presented its own challenges, is to get to a point where they aren't reliant upon you, and it's a very fine balance that we had to ride. And of course, it was me drinking lots of chai tea with the commander, working on my diabetes and lung cancer with the commander, and developing that relationship, which again is absolutely critical. So the two, having your AA team in there, working with the commander, being persistent and present is critical. Mapping and influencing stakeholders. Every mission that I've sort of been involved in has had a spaghetti C2 diagram. I think the CTF OIR was particularly difficult to understand, but what was key to success was actually understanding who the stakeholders were, so who had an interest in a particular mission, and then doing that mapping, and then identifying who the key players are and developing a relationship with them. So in terms of the operation that we're involved in relation to Baghdad, it was really about executing that through great relationships within the coalition and with our Iraqi partners. Be prepared for the risks. I'm not going to go too deep into this, but the key point here is that you have to be prepared for the bad news from your partner force. It does warrant some very uncomfortable conversations, but it is something that again, it's really important to prepare for before the mission, and to be ready for the instances where they come up, because inevitably that they may do. Developing a common lexicon. It's a fairly minor point, but I'll give one example where, I was sitting watching a bunch of our excellent trainers discuss a clearance task in an urban area, and trying to get their heads around what clear meant. Now, we have a very clear understanding of what clear is, but the Iraqis had a completely different one. They thought it meant you can see through something, therefore they interpreted that to be that you have a clear understanding of what's going on in that particular box. And watching that conversation turn around over a sort of 10-15 minute period was quite instructive for me, that we've got to have a common lexicon, and the guys, and one of the OCs is in the room here, developed, understood and had conversations about what does this task verb mean. And that's just within the Iraqi context. In the coalition, there are multiple definitions about TAA and TAAA and TAAE, and I don't think that we've adequately defined that, and I'd hope that we get to that point at the end of this process to define the sort of the BPC task verbs, and then try and find some commonality with, particularly with the ABCA nations, but certainly, you know, the NATO lexicon. It's been spoken about at length, but selecting that team is absolutely critical to success for the AA guys and girls. EQ is absolutely critically important, and again, an example I sort of cite is that there was an instance where there's a lot of tension in operations room, things weren't going well for one of our supported commands. Our guys are getting frustrated because they could see what was required to do, but the AC, to his credit, sort of recognised that he was getting frustrated, his team were frustrated, the partner force are starting to put the blinkers up, and he just took his team away and sort of retreated back to the alternate TOC for a 24-hour period, and that was very well received by our Iraqi partners and allowed to get back in once everybody had sort of calmed down and get on with the job. Now that could only be done by someone who really understands what's going on in the room and what's going on with him or her personally. For the preparing for the next fight, this is where I guess the majority of our effort sort of lay in this particular part of it. And number one is being culturally attuned, and again, that's been spoken about. For us, understanding the Iraqis beyond what you get on mission-specific training was critical, and we didn't really understand that. I think it's very difficult to really know until you get in there and you start to interact. And I guess the big things for us in terms of the Iraqi context were the value of honour. You know, they have placed a great value on honour, and, you know, unfortunately, because of that, a lot of their battalion commanders, company commanders were getting killed in action because they wanted the honour of being the first guy or the first girl, you know, into a room or into a street or driving a convoy or whatever. So that was something we had to understand. The inverse of that was saving face. So we had to be very, very careful not to put them in a position where they would perceive to be losing face, and that was quite a skill. So being culturally attuned to that, very different to their higher commanders. So therefore, applying mission command doesn't always work in that context where you have a very I guess, pyramidal structure of which there is either deference to the appointed commander or deference to a tribal member who might be in that organisation, and understanding who they were deferent to was key. Their tempo of life was around, obviously, the religion of Islam, and that is something we had to appreciate because it drove, in many ways, the operational tempo as well. And, you know, to many of our, I guess, probably not great surprise, but their humour is very similar to our own. And what you would see is a bond between our soldiers and sailors and airmen and theirs, because they, at all levels, had a very sort of similar outlook in terms of a sense of humour, which is something that we could then leverage on as we go. Being resilient, the force protection folk, and I'm sure this applies to everybody, now they had a tough job, and they had to be alert. They were constantly bored, extreme ranges of temperature, you know, wearing body loads. A very, very difficult thing to sort of balance that long periods of boredom with having to remain alert. And it's, whilst we prepare well through our sort of, you know, our resilience programs and initiatives in the Australian Army, it is something that I think should be in the forefront, particularly for those who are employed in those sort of guardian angel type roles. Having an adaptive mindset we had lots of situations where things would change, brigades would be ripped out of training and sent to operations, and we just had to accept that that was the case. Just as you're about to sort of roll out a sort of battalion level exercise, you know, that's what happens, and decisions were made often, you know, within 2 hours' notice, and you know, you see the convoys driving out as they were redeployed to another part of the country. Having professional mastery, there's two parts to this, and it goes back to point number 2 about the term I stole off one brigade, but it's been around for a while, brilliant at the basics. So the trainers have to be obviously brilliant at what they do, because overlaid on top of that is then getting that message out through an interpreter to, you know, a counterpart who may or may not be sort of taking that information in the way that you designed it to be delivered. And therefore, being absolutely proficient at what you are delivering in your training is key, so that you can occupy the majority of your conscious headspace and getting the message across and understanding how that message is being received by the person that you are training. The professional mastery bit is, the example is delivering training on 120mm mortars in Iraq. So, there's a guy training teams in the task group who were throwing the problem of delivering training on a system that I don't think anybody in the company in particular had ever delivered training on. So they then had to go through, know where to find the information about how to do it, and adapt the training so it still delivered the effect, but was within our own sort of tolerances in terms of risk and safety. So, and the only way that that can occur is through professional mastery. Measuring performance and effect here is the last one. I think we worked hard at this. I don't think we always got it right, but we tried to endeavour to measure what we did so that we could either adjust our own plan or, as a number of the presenters have pointed out, to inform our operational and strategic level headquarters, which is really important to understand what is the effect that we are delivering. Are we delivering the right effects? Very hard. We spoke a lot as a command team about how we would get around this particular problem. I think what we got to in the end was pretty reasonable for that particular point in time, but it was incredibly difficult. But I think really to sort of simplify it in my mind was you've got to understand where the organisation is when they come to you, where they are at when they leave, and then the bit that really was missing, it was the hardest bit to try and grab, is how they then performed on operations. And that we had to rely on self-reporting, which is always dangerous, and the reporting of the AA teams that actually accompanied them in the field. And again, not all of them had AA teams with them, so very hard, but I think they're the three sort of waypoints. So I think Jeff's sort of two ways of measuring are pretty much how we did it. But I would just say that you need the three-step process in measuring that effect. Okay, fighting the next war, and again, this is something, as I said earlier, we didn't have control over, but we were one of a number of task groups that were subordinate to the Land Component Command, who were very much, he and his staff were very much in this headspace, along with the Joint Task Force Commander. And really I look at this from, I guess, the operational and somewhat the strategic level, but trying to balance the priorities was absolutely critical. Now, rapid success meant that those priorities had to shift, and often the operational requirement outstripped the ability to kind of, particularly at the nation's capitals, to keep up with the changes of that, and communicating those changes was key to trying to align those. And really, the questions started to be asked, what is important now? So what is important in the short term? What is important in the long term? But how do you balance the priorities so that they're both winning, but you're building the organisation to be successful, once we all go home? We've got to assess the structures and the institutions. I would argue that a lot of failure comes from, at the start, failure in one of those two things. And I'd proffer that, one for the historians, but perhaps the Iraqi army failures. I think there's a good body of work to be done in that period between 2011 to 2014. What caused that organisation to fail to the point that they did? And I don't sort of know this, but my intuition is that it's probably based on the fact that their structures were bloated and the institutions were pretty hollow. And therefore work to rebuild those became critical, along with a number of their processes to enable them to be successful later on. We had to understand the strategic environment. I put the map up there for a reason, because it was highly complex. There were, within the country, a number of stakeholders. There are a number of competing regional powers, and of course there are a number of competing global powers, all playing in the same patch of dirt in Iraq, which really meant that, particularly I would argue that the task group level, at the land component level, trying to understand how that impacted on what you did, keeping your national chain sort of informed of those concerns, was really, a key balancing act, and for me personally, occupied a lot of my bandwidth. And I'll finish on the last point there, is that to be a critical thinker, don't just assume, and I think it's important because of the environment, that what is being done is actually right. We had to critically ask questions all the time. You know, are we doing the right things? Are we delivering the right trainings? Have we got the right targets? Have we got the right organisations? Are these guys going to be okay when we leave? How long will the political will last? And therefore, if that's a finite time, what do we have to do in that time to get them to a point where that organisation has enough capacity to survive the next fight, which, hey, by the way, will be very different to the one they've just done. So these are all questions that, you know, I was fortunate to have some great commanders who engaged all of his team to sort of ask those, and I in turn endeavoured to do that inside the task group as well. But linking that back to, you know, focusing on what's decisive and understanding that environment is not just something that occurs in capitals or at the big headquarters. Everybody's got to be involved in thinking through that. And I'll just finish up again. I'll put that up. I put that to the doctrine writers as a model. I think it's reasonably robust in terms of general military effects and BPC, but I know that smarter people than I will make it better. And ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your attention. That's me.